Sudanese citizens, it is with a deep sense of trepidation that I find myself today from the perspective of both a political and moral responsibility addressing you. We have all been watching with a sense of horror and apprehension how our beloved South Sudan continues to inexorably descend into the pit of despair and oblivion. To begin with, there is no doubt that security is the bedrock of any state that purports to be a viable member of the global community of nations. The protection of lives is the single most sacrosanct duty of the state. This is simply because personal safety is the only need that citizens, even in a neglected state such as the Republic of South Sudan, cannot provide by themselves. Of course, once citizens are left to fend for themselves in terms of protecting their lives and property, the state becomes anarchic and unviable. Since its formal independence as a sovereign state in July 2011, South Sudan has continued to grapple with multiple crises that it has not only totally failed to at least ameliorate, but only allowed to fester and worsen. The insecurity manifests itself in different forms. The Juba regime has lost the necessary political legitimacy that should underpin it, and this reality, coupled with incompetence and the determination to run both the SPLM and the government in a purely dictatorial fashion, have triggered political violence and insecurity. The government has dismally failed in discharging its duty to provide security. Consequently, both inter- and intra-communal violence, not to mention political violence, continue to needlessly claim many precious lives. Instead of addressing the serious security concerns facing the country by, among other things, starting with the adoption of mitigation measures, such as the effective disarmament of the civil population, the Juba regime remains content with half-hearted disarmament efforts that are notably starved of the necessary resources to render them productive. In fact, past attempts to disarm the civil population have foundered, primarily because the military units tasked with the disarmament exercise have not been well equipped with the armaments and other logistics needed for a successful disarmament mission. It is sad to note that many SSPDF soldiers have lost their lives in such ill-conceived disarmament campaigns because more often than not, they find themselves outnumbered and outgunned by the very armed civilians they have been sent to disarm. Current practice is that once the regime finishes with helping itself to whatever public resources it gets its hands on, it will usually employ whatever is left over, not for the protection of the people and territory of South Sudan, but rather for ensuring its own survival. The disregard for preservation of human life by the regime is so callous that the president himself has been on record on several occasions in the past saying that he was so sick and tired of the internecine killings among the population that he would not mind allowing people to butcher themselves, intervening only if and when the defeated party fled to him for protection. This means that even on an issue so critical as security, the regime's policy is reactive rather than proactive. Fellow citizens, during the protracted and bitter civil war that we waged for over 2 decades, we always harbored the hopes that one day the bountiful natural resources we have been endowed with, and especially our oil wealth, would be applied to fueling an agro-industrial surge to deliver socioeconomic prosperity. Unfortunately, none of that has come to pass. On the contrary, the tiny political elite that surrounds the president have diverted the proceeds of oil sales to their private personal accounts. This is being done through the allocation of highly inflated infrastructure development contracts especially road construction contracts, in exchange for crude oil cargoes. This results in huge financial resources being siphoned off and the economy deprived of the critical funds required to provide basic social services such as health and education. This has meant that we can neither develop human capital nor utilize the country's vast agricultural potential to diversify the economy away from excessive reliance on oil. And because South Sudan is not providing basic services, the task of treating our sick and educating our children has fallen to the benevolence of the international humanitarian community. This fact, coupled with the state's failure to diversify the economy of a potentially wealthy state, has plunged us into chronic self-inflicted poverty and misery. The economic situation is further compounded by the inability of government to consistently pay public sector wages. Without the infusion of cash into the economy, through, among others, salary payments, there is feeble demand. And without demand, the economy falters, and widespread poverty becomes inescapable. And because our plight is our own making, we have not attracted much in the way of international sympathy. Instead, the international community is gradually starting to turn its back on South Sudan. They are dismayed by the fact that South Sudan continues to avoid funding legitimate obligations that are perfectly within its financial capability, preferring instead to shift that burden onto the shoulders of the international community. Our resources may still be modest, but to think that we can just steal and squander them, hoping that others would step in to compensate for the losses and foot the entire bill for running the state, is scandalous, to say the least. Who would have thought that